Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. On this special cassette series of Reflections, Father Bacik discusses human sexuality, a gift from God, with Dr. Elizabeth Rice Allgaier, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Here's Father Bacik.
Betsy, thank you for taking time out of a busy schedule and coming to talk with me on this program. I know that you deal with the whole area of human sexuality, and so I thought that could be our topic. I don't know you real well, and I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about your work on that. You've worked on a couple books. Why don't you just tell me a bit about that?
Yes, I'm completing a couple of books, one of which is a human sexuality text, which I am co-authoring with my husband, Rick Allgaier. The other of which is an examination of the impact of changes in gender roles on sexual interaction between men and women in a variety of different situations. And I teach human sexuality at Bowling Green State University, and am very involved with research in the area. So.
I think I have found the right person, therefore, to speak with me about the whole area of human sexuality. So why don't we carry on with that? And let me start it by this way. I think I would like to begin by talking about the nature of human sexuality, since that seems to me to be important. Perhaps we could look at a couple of the problems that I would see in the culture in that regard. I think there are many ways in which we still live in a Puritan culture. That is, where people don't want to talk very freely or openly about sexual matters. It's almost seen somehow as though sex is tainted, or in the worst, maybe even something dirty. That, for example, parents still are not doing a good job of giving sex instructions to their offspring. I think you have found that attitude in your own college courses, haven't you?
Yes, one of the things that is really quite fascinating is that the number of students will report to me on a one-to-one basis that their parents are upset when they see the course, The Psychology of Human Sexuality, on their transcript. And I had one young woman whose husband or whose fiancé told her that she could not, forbid her to take the course, and said that when they were married, he would teach her everything about sex she needed to know, period.
Mm-hmm. So we find that, I was thinking recently during our Values and Ethics Week, I was invited into some of the residence halls to talk about sexual matters, and over the years that has occurred, and I often ask the students about the quality of their own sex instructions. In other words, how did their parents do that, and how good a job did they do? And I can remember in one situation sitting around with, I think it was 13 guys, maybe juniors and seniors mostly, and asking the question in this terms, well, how many of your fathers gave you what you would call just merely adequate sex instruction? And not one hand went up, 0 for 13.
Yeah,
and this few weeks ago, in doing the same thing in a mixed group, maybe of about 30 students or so, I would guess at best 1/4 would have responded affirmatively to that. I remember one young man saying at that time that when he was 18 years old, his father got him aside and began in a very embarrassed way to begin to talk to him about sexual matters a little bit. And the son's response in the group was, he says, well, I got the old man off the hook. You know, I just told him that it was okay, and I knew about all that stuff, and he wouldn't have to explain it to me. And he felt very relieved. So, I mean, we still live in many ways in a Puritan culture in which really there is this sense that one shouldn't know about this topic, or that one, which is even worse, I suppose, that there's something inherently wrong with human sexuality, that it is tainted in one way or another. And I think perhaps we still find that attitude and need ways to overcome it.
You know, it seems to me very, very sad that the condition, and by the way, all the national research backs up what you're saying, seems to me very sad. I have recently, about a year ago, had the delightful experience of talking to my one of my daughters who's just nearing the end of adolescence about the first time each of us felt sexually aroused. And we had gone out to dinner together, she and I. And the intimacy I felt with her at being able to share my own feelings and to have her share those feelings with me makes it one of the most precious times I ever spent with her. And so many mothers miss that opportunity with their sons and daughters, and fathers as well, with their sons and daughters, because they refuse to. They may talk about draw an upside-down pear and explain menstruation, but they leave out things like erection and arousal and decision-making about various aspects of sexual expression, and they're missing so much.
I like the way you explained it, that it was a beautiful experience
it was.
for you. Instead of having to be an embarrassing kind of situation, it turns out to be just the opposite of a great moment in family life.
Oh, it was.
Of course, you can't do that if you really have what we would call a puritanical attitude towards sex. Then you're not really able to do that. So what we need, it seems, first of all, is to cultivate a healthier attitude towards human sexuality before parents are ever going to get around to doing that. You have to feel comfortable with it yourself before you're able to talk about it.
Yes, yes.
I was thinking, Betsy, that what I observe in the culture is a swing in the opposite direction. Woodstock comes to my mind as maybe a watershed kind of event where the old sexual mores are sort of thrown off and things are wide open. Many people will speak about a sexual revolution in the mid-'60s or sometime, although I think the date is mixed on that. Maybe you can comment in a minute on that. But the other problem that I see going on is what I would call the playboy or playgirl philosophy that begins to want to talk about human sexuality as simply in hedonistic terms. I mean, as how much pleasure can one get? It's a matter of detached sex. Don't get involved somehow. It's a toy. It's a game. Or I think what you get, especially from the male side, that it is a means of domination. It is a means of keeping control over the opposite sex in one way or another. It seems like what happens is sex gets debased. And, of course, we've always had that in the culture. We didn't need Playboy magazine for that. I mean, it was always the counter side in any puritanical culture where we have all of the jokes about sex and the snide remarks and the talk of conquests and so on. And so
score in the locker room.
Yeah, all of that has been a continuing part of our culture, and I suppose the recent publicity and the emergence of those types of magazines and so on simply have raised that to consciousness or made it more explicit, where people will really come out and talk about, the need to act in this cool, detached way to maximize pleasure and to minimize any kind of personal involvement and so on. So I see that as a swing in the culture and something that really is causing us a great deal of difficulty on the other side. You end up, therefore, with students at our university who just don't care. For them, sex is a game, and some guy happens to get a girl pregnant, as he would say, well, that's just sort of too bad, or that's her problem, or he disappears from the scene. We get casual sex and all of the harm, I think, that often comes from that.
Yes. On the detachment issue that you mentioned, there was a wonderful, actually it was a lousy movie, but it was a very good movie from the standpoint of making a point about detachment called, Anthony Newley was the star of it, called Can Hieronymus Merkin Ever Forget Mercy Hump and Find True Happiness?
How did you ever remember that title?
Well, I talk about it in the sex class, so I finally kind of got it down to a T. But anyway, in the movie, what he does is he's looking for intimacy. He's looking for a mate. But in order to try to find a mate, what he does is to have sexual intercourse with woman after woman after woman, and he goes through the courtship process, but when he actually gets into bed, he removes himself and he winds up this wooden dummy who goes through the motions with the person, and he's not satisfied by the relationship, and so he goes on looking. And there is something very unsatisfying about a relationship in which you have not made any real contact with the other person. And the trivialization of sex.
Yes, that's a good way of saying it. Oh, my heavens, what a bizarre movie. And a graphic way of making the point of what happens. Somebody has made the comment that what has happened in that Playboy philosophy is that the fig leaf has been taken away from the genitals and put on the face.
Yes.
And that is another striking way of saying the same thing, that the personal relationship is what is cut down. The intimacy, the personal sharing, that part of it is not seen, and all of the emphasis goes on the genital activity. And it would seem that from my own perspective of Christianity and the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, that it's important to work out, therefore, a more positive notion of human sexuality and to see it in a healthier kind of way. And I think my own way of starting that would be to show that indeed we are sexual creatures through and through, that sexual talk shouldn't be just talk about the genital organs and intercourse, but that first of all, we treat our world as males and females, that sexuality stamps our whole being and personality, that it provides us with lenses through which we look at our world, that we interact with one another as either male or female, and that this is a sort of a mysterious, exciting kind of power that God has given us, and that it is not restricted just to the genital area at all, but part of our very being. I think if we get that notion, we begin with a much broader understanding of what sex is all about.
I agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I guess the one question that I would have, and I don't know whether this is the time to get into it, but you talk about males and females. There are situations in which people of the same gender may form a relationship with one another based on mutual concern, caring, a non-exploitative kind of relationship. And we are sexual beings, as you put it, through and through, and much of our interaction in the course of a day, whether or not we have sexual intercourse with anybody, much of our interaction is sexual, and that happens between men and men, and between men and women, and between women and women, and is one of God's great rewards.
Yes, right. That is should be seen as the gift that God gives us. I think that's part of it is that it brings the zest and the excitement to our lives. That we were talking before on another occasion about flirting and sexual harassment and so on, and that you were suggesting that the chapter in your book, I think, that was speaking positively about flirting.
Oh, yes.
That's the neat thing, the interaction between the male and the female, and that can be exciting as long as it's mutual and that both people are enjoying it, and that I suppose it's the complementarity that we have to look at here, that really, you'd go back to somebody like Carl Jung, who I think did a good job of pointing out to us that while we have a dominant gender, the male will have within him the anima, the opposite pole, the female pole, and that somehow that needs to get developed, and that the woman would have the same sort of situation, and that perhaps what is happening in a way is that for the male, the anima is being touched in a way, that women help to open that up and help the man to be more in touch with all of that. So I think that then that would be carefully distinguished from the kind of sexual interaction where the one party wouldn't be interested in it, which I guess we've often talked about as sexual harassment on the job, for example,
right.
and that kind of thing. But again, I guess we're on that notion that of stamping the whole personality, and that we're always interacting as males and females, and that it seems important that we are aware of that, and that that is an enriching sort of experience. again, it could be just the opposite, couldn't it be? It could be where people are afraid of that kind of intimacy or afraid of that conversation, or where maybe the male screens out whatever the female has to say, or can't think of there being any other kind of intimacy than genital intimacy,
Yes.
therefore missing all the joys of conversation, or the kind of experience that you described with your daughter.
Yes.
And I think that, so we would be missing a lot if we didn't see it that way.
Yes, for people who are sexually experienced and have been relating sexually to a partner for a long period of time, they can probably examine their own past experience with their partner and know that there were times when they were having sexual intercourse when very little was going on in terms of intimacy, and remember other times when they were sitting together revealing or receiving information about one another over a glass of wine or whatever, and feeling very vulnerable, very much in touch with one another, very intimate and very sexual. And,
yes, I know I was speaking to someone recently talking like that, was saying that in their married life and their sexual activity there was something missing, and sort of the words that we latched on to describe it was a lack of communion of spirit. That there's something more going on. I think that's the great problem with talking about sexuality simply in bodily, genital terms. Dr. Rubin's book, whatever you wanted to know about sex, I'm afraid to ask or something. It says some important things, and I remember some of the college women saying that book was very important to them because they learned facts and so on that they didn't know. But my problem with it would be that it doesn't root sexuality in the deeper human reality, and that we are not just bodily creatures. We are inspirited bodies. We have another dimension to us. That we have a psychological, emotional, mental, intellectual, as well as bodily dimension, and that it's that communion of the total person that probably is important as we begin to talk about sexuality.
And that's what makes it so exciting. The mere friction of a portion of one's body without any of the other kinds of contact you just described is part of that trivialization that we were talking about earlier, which robs the act that can occur from its magic and its sense of contact and intimacy and so forth. And by the way, I don't think that's necessarily bad for an individual to experience friction of their body by themselves or with another person, but it just isn't what it could be. If they settle for that, they're selling themselves cheap, kind of thing.
I guess I would be very attuned to the kinds of dangers that would be happening in that situation, and where people would end up getting hurt.
Yes.
And I'd be very interested in that side of it. Of course, from my own Christian framework, we would have to be thinking about the problem of sin in all of this, because you have to remember that this sexuality is part of a human nature that is itself ambivalent. That is, that we have these strange impulses to good, to charity, to reaching out, to loving other people, to help humanizing, creating a better world. But we know an opposite set of impulses as well. We know the impulse to selfishness, to pride, to false inadequacy about ourselves, of a turning in on ourselves. In other words, we know a mixture of good and evil in the human heart. That line between good and evil isn't between a certain class of people and another group. It runs right through our own heart. The great thinkers have talked about that. St. Paul, in my own Christian tradition, had this striking idea that sometimes I don't do the things I know I should do, and at other times I do things that I know I shouldn't, that I actually hate. I hate them, and yet I do them anyway. That is that strange mixture in the human heart between good and evil. And we like to talk about that in terms of original sin as the flawed situation in which we live, that there is this propensity to evil as well as good. Of course, in my own outlook, I always want to insist that the power to good is always greater, that we have a saying, again from Paul, that wherever sin exists, grace more abounds, that grace is more powerful than any of the sin that we know in our world. And so that gives a fundamentally positive outlook on this. But I still have to admit that there is this tendency to selfishness, and it can come out in the sexual area very clearly. I mean, just because the sexual area is so involving, it's impossible to have illusions, and it's possible to misread situations, to use it as a means of dominating another person. So it's very important, seems to me, to dictate that there is a certain carefulness in that we make sure we root it in a proper notion of human nature. We are sexual creatures through and through. We are part of our human nature, but our human nature itself is mixed. Certainly we don't want to say that the greatest sins are the sins against purity. For us, the greatest virtue is charity, not purity. And for us, the greatest commandment is to love other people and to love God and love other people as ourselves, and not, thou shalt not commit adultery. We Christians must keep a proper perspective on that. Charity and love are the great virtues and the great calls. And very often our real sins are those of pride, or on the opposite side of the false sense of inadequacy. So I know I've heard you comment in other situations where you don't want somehow sex to be seen as bad, or that to be the major sin. I think I'm responding to that kind of thing that I've heard you say on other occasions.
Yes, I object to the notion of sex as sin. It seems to me that the abuse of sex, the use of sex to dominate another person, to try to control a relationship, to try to gain access to another person who does not wish to be accessible, those kinds of activities are sinful.
You're picking up my vocabulary.
I'm picking up your
yeah.
vocabulary, and
Yeah.
it's not one with which I'm totally comfortable.
Yeah.
But I could accept the idea of those kinds of activities as being sinful. But it is not the sex per se,
No.
it's the abuse of it, which is the problem as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's really vital. You see, we live in a tradition, that Puritan tradition that we have received in the United States as a Catholic counterpart as well, which comes through St. Augustine and through what we know as Jansenism and so on, which looks the same way, that sex is tainted somehow. This act of intercourse is the way that sin is sort of brought into the world, the way original sin is transmitted. And I think we're really trying to move beyond that these days and trying to get away from that negative outlook, because it causes so much harm. Really, we need this more positive notion that sexuality is a gift from God. And you used that phrase before yourself. And I'm waiting for the day when the next generation will give their children sex instructions much as you did in talking to your daughter, or those who work out of the Christian framework, who would be able to, the father would say to his son, when your mother and I make love, we feel close to God. Or that's one of the times when I get over my selfishness most and think of pleasing your mother. Or when we're close together and in the act of intercourse, that is for us a religious type experience. I mean, I think if a father could talk to his son like that, we would move way ahead in our general culture in dealing more responsibly with sexuality.
Or to his daughter.
Yes. Well put. I guess I don't usually think in those terms.
No, we do tend to segregate to an extent in that area, which perhaps perpetuates the idea that we are more different than we in fact are.
You'd like to see more of that, maybe. Mothers talking to their sons about sexuality. Oh, I can see the obvious wisdom of that as soon as you say it.
Family members, yes.
Yeah. As soon as you say it, I see the obvious wisdom, because we come at things differently, don't we? We're still males and females. We see the world a little different. We experience sexuality differently. Right, we should get a little bit in here, Betsy, about the whole other part of sex, not just that it stamps our personality, but it's what draws us together. It's what propels us towards members of the opposite sex. It produces a lot of good friendships and intimate sharings. It's what produces marriages and brings people together in the act of intercourse and brings children into the world. So there is that unifying part of sexuality. I don't know that we've saved a lot of time for that, but certainly it's a vital part of it.
Yes, I would certainly agree. It lends a zest as well as a way to be in contact with one another in what are at times a fairly mundane kind of schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so again we get that the pleasure side. You made a point before about pleasure being important, and
yes.
I think in our Christian tradition that is really true. We have Thomas Aquinas, one of our classical great thinkers, was very big on the idea that pleasure was a positive force in our life and should be used positively. And I think that could be easily related to the whole area of sexuality here.
I would agree.
Betsy, maybe we have more agreement than I might have thought. We come out of very different backgrounds and traditions. I'm sure if we took the discussion in little different directions, we'd probably find more disagreement. But I guess the way I've tried to look at this here is that on the one side we've got a Puritanism that we try to fight. You try to do it through your university courses. You talk very openly. I've heard your classes on that and talk very openly, clearly about sexual matters. That seems terrific to me. Speaking out of my own pastoral kind of situation, it seems so important to emphasize the positive side of sex and that it is a gift from God, that it's redeemed by Jesus Christ, that it stamps our whole personality and so on. The other side trying to avoid this playboy philosophy of people who want to trivialize. I like the way you described that, the trivialization of sex, because that's what really happens in that philosophy. It's then treated as a toy rather than as the opportunity for intimate sharing that we have received from our God, and which is the great gift that we have received in life. So that I want to come down on this positive. We got a lot of negative notions yet in the Christian world, Judeo-Christian tradition, but finally want to get down to this. It's a gift from God. It is makes up what we are as males and females and gives us that great thing of bringing us together as we move towards greater intimacy.
This has been